In the 1970s, owing to a toxic combination of low growth and high inflation, the UK became known as the sick man of Europe. Today, as Duncan Weldon writes in this week's New Statesman cover story, that label is once again being applied to the UK. To discuss why that's the case, I'm joined by Duncan, who's the author of 200 Years of Muddling Through, A History of the British Economy, and the author of the value-added newsletter for Substack. Thank you for joining us. The UK economy shrank by 0.3% in the most recent month, and Britain is forecast by the OECD to grow slower than every major economy except Russia next year. Why is the outlook so poor?
Well, the outlook is very poor. So, the economy is shrinking now. It's been shrinking for the last 2 months. We don't know what's going to happen in the rest of this year. Touch wood, we'll avoid a recession. Economists think we'll avoid a recession, but economists are really bad at spotting recessions in advance. But as you say, the more worrying thing is next year. The OECD reckons that Britain's economy will stagnate next year when most of our peers are growing. And that's because we've got just about everything that could go wrong for growth going wrong at the same time. We've got the Bank of England raising interest rates. We've got fiscal policy, that's tax and spend, being quite tight. Taxes are going up. We've got high inflation, so incomes are being squeezed, people can't spend. The export environment's tough and businesses aren't investing. So it's just this sort of perfect storm hitting the British economy in the early 2020s.
Now, Remainers like to say that this has everything to do with Brexit. Leavers like to say that this has nothing to do with Brexit. Who's right?
The truth, I'm afraid, probably lies somewhere in between. Brexit is making things harder. It makes things harder for British exporters. It's now harder for them to sell into what still is our single largest export market. There used to be frictionless trade. Now there are distinct frictions. Brexit is not helping. Now, you can't look at the British economy today and say, if Brexit hadn't happened, everything would be perfect. It wouldn't be, economies around the globe are having problems at the moment. High inflation is not a uniquely British problem. Brexit is making things worse. It's not the primary cause of our current problems, but it's certainly not a help.
And as you say in the piece, stagnant growth isn't a new problem. So in the decade before the 2008 financial crisis, the UK economy was growing at an average around 2.7% of GDP. Now the average is more like 1.7%. Is the real problem that the UK hasn't found a model for the post-crash era?
That's exactly the problem. The early 2020s look awful for the British economy, but it's not an awful period following boom times. It's an awful period following, a distinctly soggy 2010s. Our growth rate collapsed after the 2010s. In the run-up to the financial crisis, as you say, the economy was growing at 2.7%. In the decade afterwards, it grew at 1.7%. Now, we should just be clear, 1% a year doesn't sound like much. But if the economy had grown after the financial crisis at the same sort of rate it grew in the decade before, then income per head in Britain would be about £6,500 higher today than it is. £6,500 is not a small sum per head. So yeah, we've got this very soggy backdrop. In the 2010s, the big story really that I think economic historians will identify when they look back in 30 or 40 years' time. The big story of the 2010s was a collapse in the rate of productivity growth in Britain, which really just, hits our living standards, hits our growth prospects. And it's why people look at what's happening now, look back at the last 10, 15 years and say something's gone seriously wrong. Real wages, that's wages when you take account of changes in prices, inflation, in 2025 are expected to be roughly where they were in 2008. It's like almost 2 decades of lost income growth for British people, British workers. It's a slow burning crisis, but it's a crisis.
The hope in the past, say in the 1990s, was that the technological revolution would stem higher productivity. Why hasn't that proved to be the case?
So Britain's productivity growth from the late 80s into the 1990s, the early 2000s was good. So second highest amongst the G7 group of economies. Since then, it's been the second lowest. We were only behind the US, now we're only ahead of Italy. It's a radical change. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to give you the slightly boring answer that economists have spent 10 years talking about a British productivity puzzle, which is sort of an alliterative way of saying we don't really know what went wrong. it appears lots of things went wrong. Sort of specific, idiosyncratic things affecting certain sectors. Poor skill levels, poor management, the aftermath of the banking crisis that made it harder for banks to extend credit where it was needed. And, Britain's economy, financial services had been at the core. So when you get a crisis which is focused on the financial sector, Britain gets hard hit by it. And I would add to that as well, I think part of the explanation has to be some really rather poor macroeconomic policy choices in the 2010s when, the David Cameron government prioritised the public finances over growth. It had austerity, it reduced demand. I don't think that was at all helpful for things like corporate investment or for productivity growth.
You mentioned Italy there, and in the piece you say amusingly that the UK could end up like Italy but without the pleasant weather. Do you want to elaborate on that comparison?
Well, I think Italy is sort of the cautionary tale for relative economic decline. It's almost easy to forget now, but if you think back to the early 1990s, Italian GDP per head, Italian national income per head, was roughly the same as Germany's. It was a very rich country. You fast forward 10 years to the early 2000s, and Italy has fallen behind Germany, but is still ahead of Britain. You zoom forward to now, and Italian GDP per head is more comparable to Spain's. That's 30 years of a sort of slow loss of economic standing in the world. And I think the really pernicious problem with these sort of embedded productivity problems, with these slow economic declines is, they happen with a whimper rather than a bang. Rising unemployment or really high inflation, that's the kind of things that voters notice straight away and that politicians have to respond to. But if you've got this much slower playing out, sort of gradual loss of economic dynamism and oomph, you almost don't notice till it's happened. You wake up one day and realise you're no longer one of the richest countries in Western Europe. You're firmly mid-table.
What can the UK learn from more successful economies such as Germany?
Well, I think the UK can learn an awful lot of things. We know there are certain problems affecting the British economy now, which we can take steps to act on. They're not easy problems because there's political constraints, but we can look at fixing things like housing. Housing costs are really high in Britain. We can look at fixing things like childcare costs, which mean that many people, particularly women, struggle to be as economically active as they could be because they've got to look after children. So things like housing costs, things like childcare, things like our national infrastructure, particularly in terms of transport links, particularly once you get outside of London. These are all useful things that would help our productivity growth to pick up. None of them are quick fixes. None of them are things you're realistically going to do in one electoral cycle, but they take a government. I think what you really need is a government that sort of steps back and says, two things. It says, what are Britain's economic problems? And it more fundamentally says, what sort of economic model do we want Britain to have? Where do we want our growth to come from? We had an economic model. It was led by financial services. That was really badly damaged by what happened between 2007 and 2009. So we sort of then stumbled on with this slightly broken economic model. Brexit may have killed it, and now we're sort of lacking a coherent plan and just being buffeted by shock after shock, whether that's the pandemic or the inflation coming from the war in Ukraine.
On a global level in general, the West's economic performance in the post-crash years has not been impressive. Some countries faring better than others, but economists talk of secular stagnation. Do you want to explain that concept and which side of the divide you come down on?
Secular stagnation is the idea that something had gone wrong with the Western model of growth in the 2010s. The level of corporate investment required to produce full employment and healthy growing economies was just becoming harder and harder to hit, that interest rates had to be made lower and lower and lower to sort of get them, which is why interest rates fell from 4 or 5% to essentially zero across much of the West. And still, even with interest rates that low, growth just wasn't strong enough in many cases to get employment back to the kind of levels we'd enjoyed before 2008. And it was the sense that you really needed something to kickstart the economy. This is sort of the debate before the pandemic, that monetary policy, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, whatever, the ECB, alone wasn't enough, that you needed more sort of aggressive fiscal policy, more government spending, sort of kickstart the economy, help interest rates get off the floor. Now, the pandemic has slightly changed that because, if you go back 5 years, everyone's worrying that inflation isn't high enough. And now that would be a nice problem to have in a time when inflation is the highest it's been in 40 years. I think the big question is, has there been sort of a fundamental shift in the growth and inflation outlook? Are we now in a world of structurally higher inflation? That's what's worrying many analysts. I still think we're probably not. I think inflation is high, but that's a food price story, that's an energy price story, that's a global supply chain story. That will all eventually work itself through the system. You look at the jobs market. We've got, in many ways, the tightest jobs market Britain's ever had. There are more job vacancies than unemployed people. And yet still, real wages are falling. And I think unless you get a fundamental change in the nature of the jobs market, you're not going to get that sort of domestically generated inflation, which would mean we're in a whole new era. So, I wouldn't be surprised if we had a year, 18 months, even 2 years of uncomfortably high inflation, and then by the middle of the 2020s, we were back to bemoaning inflation being too low, the economy not having the oomph we wanted to have, oomph being, as you guess, a very technical economic term.
And then the West in recent years benefited from a glut of cheap goods from China. Is that era now coming to an end?
That's the other part of it. So you look at given inflation is the highest it's been since the early 1980s, it's very easy to reach for the example of the 1970s and say, Britain is heading back into the 1970s, very high inflation, all of that sort of stuff. But I think there have been a couple of really big structural shifts in the nature of the British economy and other Western economies over the last few decades. The first one is a fundamental transformation of the labour market, the jobs market. Union density, union membership is sort of a fraction of what it was. 50% of Britons were in a trade union in the 1970s. In the private sector today, it's more like 1 in 8. The jobs market is much more small L liberal, much more flexible. It's easier to hire, it's easier to fire. Just a much more flexible jobs market. And the other part of it is globalization. The economies are much less nationally focused. They're much more globalized. Supply chains are international. You can buy cheap goods abroad. And I think it's those two factors which explain a lot of the drop in inflation over the last few decades. And it sort of comes back to Brexit too, as we touch on in this week's article. If you look at sort of what some of the advocates of Brexit were saying, they were saying, yes, leaving the European Union's customs union and single market is going to be a cost to the British economy, but we're going to make good that cost by signing free trade agreements all around the world, by deregulating sort of 1980s semi-Thatcherite, liberalisation of the British economy. But what's fascinating is many, many large British firms aren't particularly keen on this. When we look at car makers or finance, they would actually, they're not against deregulation, but given a choice between deregulation and retaining access to a European market, it's that European market that's more important to them. So you've got this strange position of sort of right-of-centre British politicians going around saying we're going to deregulate, and British business saying, actually, we'd rather not if the cost is losing access to this large market.
And do you think that's why they're scrabbling around for symbolic measures such as reintroducing imperial measures and so on? Because actually it's one thing winning political campaigns, it's another thing deciding what you actually want to use Brexit for.
There were lots of different arguments in favour of Brexit. The one that tends to get associated now with the government was this sort of global Britain, buccaneering, free trading, deregulatory, Singapore on Thames, all of that sort of stuff. And I think it's sort of ground to a halt for two reasons. One is this this problem that it was a plan to revive British capitalism without ever really considering just how British capitalism is. The big firms in Britain are not focused just on Britain. They're not as keen on this agenda as some of the sort of muscle memory of Thatcherism advocates were. And the second one is the political problem. That, if you look at where the votes for leave stacked up, and certainly the case presented by leading Brexiteers was this was a sort of a revolt of left behind places against an out-of-touch elite. This is a story of the so-called Red Wall in the north of England and the Midlands. Now, I don't know what sort of leave voters in supposedly left behind places we're actually voting for. But I doubt they were voting for deregulation and exposure to competition with fast-growing emerging markets. So you're sort of left with, they've won the vote. They've enacted their form of Brexit. We've taken an economic hit in terms of trade with our largest trading partner being harder, but they're sort of politically stuck. They can't move towards the supposed upsides. And so you're left sort of scrambling around for symbolic wins to prove that the cost was worth it after all.
To the extent that the government has an economic plan, they would say it's levelling it up. Is the problem that they haven't really worked out what they mean by levelling up, or that they're not putting enough money behind it?
I think it's a bit of both. So, levelling up sort of means all things to all people at different times. I've seen bits of education policy, bits of health policy being branded as helping with levelling up over the last year. It's unclear what is being levelled up, who is being levelled up, where is being levelled up. I think there are almost sort of two agendas there. There's a sort of a serious economic policy agenda of how do we narrow regional economic divides within the UK, and the UK has huge regional economic divides, bigger than any other country in Western Europe. How do you narrow those regional divides? That's a sort of an employment levels, a skills, a productivity, a gross value added in economic terms policy. And then there's a more sort of cosmetic levelling up, which is more of a placemaking agenda. How do you make high streets nicer? How do you fix local bus services? What do you do with bandstands and hanging baskets? And that's all important. And I genuinely think, making places a better place to live is good policy, but it's not an economic policy. So I think the government is sort of, but the government finds itself focused more on that agenda for the reasons that it's cheaper, you can do it quicker, you get much more noticeable results in terms of one political cycle than a sort of, a policy to narrow economic divides within Britain is a 10 to 30 year expensive agenda. Making some towns, which the Conservatives won for the first time in 2019, a bit nicer is the kind of thing you can do in one parliamentary term quite quickly.
And it increasingly feels as if the government doesn't have an economic model, but an economic muddle. That the promise of Boris Johnson's Conservatives and some of their supporters was that this heralded a return to a more interventionist brand of Toryism, a bigger state, higher public spending, delivering for voters in the so-called Red Wall. But more recently, you're hearing reheated Thatcherite rhetoric of cutting red tape, cutting taxes, slashing Whitehall, and the voters could be forgiven for being a bit confused.
Oh, completely. There isn't a coherent economic plan. What there is a series of sort of short-term reactive policies, often driven by the internal politics of the Conservative Party rather than the needs of the country. So, we're in this sort of weird and sort of through the looking glass world of the Chancellor at every sort of fiscal event, as we call them, spring statement, budget, whatever, sort of finishing with how he likes cutting taxes. He's an instinctive tax cutter, whilst at the same time making the most substantial tax rises since the early 1990s. Tax as a share of GDP, the tax take, is going back to levels we've not seen since the late 1940s. And it's how you square this. Yes, you've got one part of Boris Johnson, I'm this sort of dirigiste, I want to spend on the Red Wall, big infrastructure projects, coupled with I'm also a tax cutter, and I don't think you can square them. So it's sort of flavour of the month, changes time by time. You get the impression no one has stepped back and said, what do we think the British economy should look like in 2025, 2030, and how do we get there?
On Europe again, you've recently seen interventions by Daniel Hannan, leading Brexiteer, who said it might have been better if the UK had stayed in the single market. Tobias Ellwood, Conservative MP, who's called for the UK to rejoin the single market. Do you think that over time economic logic will force the UK to forge closer ties with the EU?
Well, your sort of standard sort of workhorse model of how international trade works is the gravity model. And that says how much trade two countries do depends on how big those countries are and how close they are together. You trade more with big countries near you. And, from Britain's point of view, the big economic bloc near us is the European Union. And I think this is why, I used to find it quite sad when, we said getting Brexit done or Brexit is done now. This is tragically sad, George, but Britain's trading relationship with the European Union is something which is going to be in the news and on the agenda for the rest of our working lives. It's never going to go away. It's our largest trading partner. It's a big economic bloc. It's just across the channel. So, Sometimes we will probably move closer, sometimes we will probably oscillate further away. But this is never going to be a sort of an event which is done. This is an ongoing process and relationship.
And finally, lest we be accused of being too gloomy, what are the reasons for economic optimism?
Well, the thing is, it's very easy to be gloomy about Britain's economy. I'm often gloomy about Britain's economy, but, fundamentally, Britain is still, a leading global economy. It's still got a relatively high level of GDP per head, and it's still got actually some really important strengths, particularly in the services sector. And that's not just finance, it's also creative industries, it's legal and accountancy. We are, in many ways, the Saudi Arabia of services when it comes to the global economy. We're a very, very successful player in that. And we've also still got some very important high-value manufacturing. We've got some of the best universities in the world, which we should think of as an export industry. These are all, reasons for optimism, but the best reason for optimism is one that sounds a little pessimistic. It's that our productivity per hour worked is still 20% below that of France, or more than that behind the United States. And that's actually grounds for optimism, because there's nothing, in the water in France and America which makes them more productive than we are. The fact that other advanced economies have these high levels of productivity suggests the potential is there for us to catch up to the global frontier.
Thanks, Duncan. And you can read Duncan's cover story on how the UK became the new sick man of Europe by subscribing to the New Statesman today.